The bronze mirror told the truth first, as it always did, and the truth arrived on the senator's face like a slow tide of cold displeasure rising from the jaw upward until it had overtaken every other expression that face had ever worn. He sat in his carved chair, the good chair, the one reserved for mornings of consequence, and held the mirror at arm's length and then closer and then at arm's length again, as though the distance between himself and the polished surface might be negotiated into showing him something different from what it was currently showing him. The warm terracotta and ivory tones of the atrium moved around him in their accustomed patterns, the morning light pressing down through the compluvium in a column that caught the marble dust still settling from the night, and the slave who held the mirror stood in that light with his arm fully extended, his whole body in the rigid posture of a person trying to be invisible while performing the most visible possible function. Every senator in Rome had looked better than he currently looked. Every citizen of the plebeian class had looked better. The uneven line of the cut, one side trimmed with reasonable precision, the other apparently attacked with some secondary intention that had nothing to do with aesthetics, presented itself in the bronze surface with the impartial honesty that polished metal always offered and that polished metal would always have to answer for. He said nothing for a long time. The slave's arm trembled infinitesimally. The silence was of the kind that Rome produced specifically for these occasions, for the interval between the discovery of a wrong and the formal response to it. The tonsor who had created the problem was still present. This was his fundamental error. He crouched at the senator's left side with the professional instinct of a man trying to inspect his own work from the inside, his head lowered to the level of the cut and his eyes making the kind of rapid, precise assessment that skilled craftsmen make when they are trying to understand what went wrong without having to admit that anything went wrong. The client's face was in the bronze mirror and the tonsor's face was also in the bronze mirror, and both faces were visible simultaneously in the amber light that played across the impasto surface of the reflective metal, and one of the two faces showed cold fury with the specific temperature that Roman patrician displeasure achieved before it became action, and the other showed barely contained professional collapse. A warm sidelight came from the right, pressing between the atrium columns and finding the marble floor and rising to illuminate the scene from below the mirror and above simultaneously. And in this light the unevenness of the cut was not flattered or softened but was presented with complete candor, one side sitting level at the temple and the other conducting a separate arrangement that had departed from the level position without explanation and without apparent intention of returning. 3 women gathered in the corridor beyond the atrium doorway, their heads pressed together at an angle that suggested they had been there some time before the voices on the other side of the door had given way to the present silence. 3 noble women with the specific posture of those who have already assessed a situation and are now waiting only for the formal public phase of the assessment to begin. The 4th woman, who had committed the error of returning home from the tonsorina first, was seated in the center of the room beyond in a posture of mortification so complete it had become its own architectural feature, another column in a room that already had several. Her hair was draped with red and white fabrics in a manner that was partly fashion and partly the strategic engineering of a woman attempting to compress an obvious disaster into as small a visible footprint as possible, and the 3 women who had gathered to witness its full extent raised their hands when they saw it in the particular gesture of theatrical Roman dismay that served simultaneously as reaction, commentary, and social positioning. They had all been to the same tonsrics. They all had opinions about the tonsrics. None of those opinions had been communicated to the woman now seated in the center of the room before her appointment, and this collective failure of warning added a layer of shared guilt to the assembled theatrical dismay that made it, if anything, more vivid. The barber with trembling hands was attempting to fix the thing he had done, and his hands moved with the specific vibration of someone whose body has received distress signals from the brain but whose instructions to the extremities have been interrupted somewhere along the chain of command. The chair in which his client sat was a good chair, the kind that expensive households kept specifically for these purposes, and the client's hands on its arms had achieved a grip of such intensity that the knuckles were clearly legible in the warm dramatic sidelight that came through the terracotta column at the room's far end. An iron comb lay on the marble floor in the foreground, dropped during the previous failed exchange, and it sat there with the specific stillness of an implement that has been released in anger and has not yet been reclaimed. Every detail of the room was warm and specific and correct in the manner of rooms that have been inhabited for many generations by people who understood that the details of a room were also the details of a self. The marble columns, the plaster walls with their paintwork, the good chair, the dropped comb on the marble floor, And into this room of correct details the trembling hands were introducing an element of fundamental incorrectness that the room's own architecture seemed to be registering as a kind of moral affront. He dismissed the barber with the back of his hand. The gesture was clean and minimal and final in the way of gestures that have been rehearsed by generations of Roman men on the backs of their right hands until the gesture itself no longer required conscious execution but occurred as a natural expression of a condition. The barber backed away with his tools in the particular retreat of someone who has been dismissed but has not yet cleared the spatial threshold of the dismissal and is navigating the distance between the chair and the door with the care of a man crossing uncertain ground. Servants watched from a doorway behind in that deeply Roman manner of watching that involved every sense except the one that would confirm to the watched party that they were being watched. The patrician's profile in the strong warm directional light from the marble hall was a profile that had been trained since infancy to express dignity and authority, and the specific version of displeasure that Roman men of rank expressed when dealing with failures by those in their household. And the profile was performing this training now with the absolute consistency of a face that did not know how to do anything halfway. Behind the profile, through the open sky visible at the end of the marble hall, the white light of a Roman morning continued its work on the city below without any acknowledgement of what was happening in this hall or what the profile intended to do about it. The young man and his father stood in the garden light that came through the columned portico in that particular quality of Roman morning that was warm without being golden yet, the kind of light that arrived before the sun had fully committed to the day. They were in profile, both facing the same direction in the way of people who are examining something that is located between them rather than in either of them, which in this case was the young man's hair and the question of what to do about it. The father's eyebrow performed a single, controlled ascent of perhaps 3 millimeters that communicated, with the precision of an instrument, the complete assessment of what he was seeing. This was dignified Roman disapproval at its most refined. Not the explosion, not the gesture, not the raised voice, but the single elevated eyebrow that was in some ways worse than all of those because it contained them as possibilities within its restraint and suggested that the restraint was deliberate and not inevitable. The young man's expression was the expression of someone who has already conducted the same assessment himself in the bronze mirror at dawn and arrived at the same conclusions and has been waiting all morning for someone else to arrive there officially. The soft garden light through the columned portico refused to improve the situation. On the eve of his public appearance, the general sat before his tent mirror with the expression of a man who has faced armies across open fields and found in that experience a baseline for the assessment of adversity that the mirror was currently failing to meet. One side, the left side, the camp barber who had been summoned and who was now standing behind him in the military camp background, rendered in the soft morning light that came through the tent's opening with the quality of light that had not yet decided whether to be military light or domestic light, was standing with the specific stillness of a man who has made an error in front of a person of considerable authority and is waiting for the authority to define the consequences. The orderlies in the background were frozen, not the stillness of objects but the voluntary stillness of bodies that have assessed the room and found that remaining motionless is the current optimal strategy. All of them visible in the tent's warm amber morning light, which was already warming into the kind of day that required a public appearance from a general whose presentation was, at this moment, not fully aligned with the requirements of public appearances. The slave on his knees before the mistress had been on his knees in this position long enough for his body to have accepted it and composed itself within it with the resigned dignity of a person who has understood that the position will continue for as long as the mistress has things to say. And the mistress had things to say. Her finger pointed at her fringe with the straight-line precision of a woman who had been building toward this moment since she first examined the cut in the mirror of the dressing room, who had been rehearsing the geometry of the indictment in her mind through all the hours of the morning that had preceded this confrontation, and the finger's angle was the angle of the distance between what she had commissioned and what she had received. The ladies in waiting arranged themselves in the background of the warm ivory and terracotta interior with the expressions of women who have seen this exact performance before and are maintaining the appropriate facial responses. Sympathy for the mistress, careful neutrality toward the slave, while the suppressed amusement that both the situation and their long experience of the mistress produced leaked slightly through the careful maintenance of those appropriate responses. The fountain in the atrium glimpsed behind the figure group continued its work on the water's surface without acknowledgement of the ceremony happening in the foreground. The man with the shears had been cutting his own hair for what appeared, from the quality of the result and the expression of the slave watching from behind, to be approximately 5 minutes, and in those 5 minutes he had achieved a result that bore a complicated relationship to the one that had preceded it. The bronze mirror in the marble bathroom interior showed him with the honest immediacy that bronze mirrors always showed things, without the hesitation that more polished surfaces sometimes inserted between observation and comprehension, and what it showed him was the aftermath of his independent intervention into a situation that had already been professionally difficult. The shears were still in his right hand. The slave behind him was watching with the expression that slaves wore when they had been specifically forbidden from intervening in a master's self-determined project, and were now observing the results of that self-determination with the complex feelings of someone who had predicted the outcome precisely and has only the inadequate compensation of private accuracy to show for it. The dramatic warm sidelight from the marble bathroom interior's high window found the master's head and the slave's face and the shears and the bronze mirror all at once and rendered them together in the amber and ivory tones of a painting that knew exactly what it was depicting. At the street Tansrina, the two men had come to stand together in the particular configuration of people comparing things they have not yet officially admitted are comparable, both of them facing the general direction of their reflections in the various polished surfaces that the Tansrina's interior provided, and the comparison that was developing between them was a comparison that was making both of them increasingly upset at approximately the same rate, so that their expressions were tracking the same trajectory toward the same conclusion along different paths. The same barber. The visible fact of the same barber moved through both their assessments simultaneously, the slight leftward inclination on the right side, the particular way the cut sat above the ear, the signature of a specific hand that was becoming more familiar the longer they compared it. The barber in question was visible through a doorway pretending to be occupied with a task that required his complete attention, and would continue to require it until either the two men had left or something changed the present configuration. The warm exterior light on the figures was the light of a Roman street, specific and direct and entirely without mercy. The Roman woman examining the slave's haircut held the slave's chin between two fingers with the clinical detachment of a person performing a quality inspection on a piece of work that had been done in her name and with her materials and was now failing to meet the specifications that her name and materials implied. She turned the head with the two fingers in the small precise rotation needed to see the other side, and the slave stared at a point approximately 2 feet in front of her face and slightly above eye level with the expression of someone who has accepted that the present moment is beyond their jurisdiction and is navigating it through the specific discipline of absolute absence of reaction. The rich terracotta and white drapery fell from the examining woman's arm in the correct way, and the marble columns behind her were in the correct position, and the warm sidelight through the atrium arch was the correct temperature and angle, and everything in the scene was in its correct position except the haircut, which was not. The politician at the portico entrance adjusted the laurel wreath in the amber light of the morning with the concentration of a man deploying a natural resource. Laurel wreath. Oak leaves. Anything with structural integrity and sufficient density to cover a lateral span of approximately 4 inches at the temple could serve the purpose, and the laurel was both structurally adequate and publicly legible in the way that the occasion required. A civic crown, a ceremonial item, an object that announced its presence as something other than a haircut remedy, without entirely ruling out the possibility that it was also serving that function. His body slave assisted with the anxious precision of someone whose professional duty and personal anxiety were currently perfectly aligned, and together they worked at the wreath's positioning with the focused collaboration of two people who both understood what was at stake and both understood that the portico entrance behind them was already framing a crowd and the crowd was already waiting. The tonsor with the mirror was holding it at the particular angle that barbers develop over years of managing difficult moments, the angle that showed the client the portion of the cut that was working well and presented it with the slight upward tilt that catches the best light on any given arrangement, the angle that a less experienced professional might have called dishonest but that the tonsor considered an exercise in proportional emphasis. His lips were pressed together in the specific way of a professional who has something he is not saying and is investing considerable energy in not saying it. Across the warm ambient light of the Tansrina, the other patrons watched the mirror negotiation with the entertained expressions of people who have been in the chair themselves and understand the exact dynamics of the moment. The mirror held at the strategic angle, the client beginning to turn his head just slightly toward the part of the cut that has not been presented, the barber's lips pressing together fractionally harder as the turn begins. The matron issued her command with the authority of someone whose commands had been issued for long enough that the issuing of them had become part of the architecture of the household, part of the structure that held everything else in its place. 2 slaves, both working simultaneously, one holding the mirror at the exact angle she specified with both hands, her arms locked at the specified elevation, her eyes fixed on a middle distance that was not the mirror but was adjacent to the mirror's emotional territory. The other wielding the iron with the focused attention of a slave, who understood that the margin for further error in this room was currently zero, and that her hands were the instruments of the household's recovery from a crisis that she had not created but was being asked to resolve. The matron's expression in the warm orange and white interior was imperious in the absolute sense, not performing imperiousness but existing in it, having inhabited it since childhood, wearing it as naturally as the rich fabrics that fell from her shoulders in the correct way. The young man wrapping his toga over his head before entering the forum had committed to a strategy that required the complete suppression of self-consciousness about the strategy, because the strategy only worked if the person executing it appeared not to be executing a strategy. His companion watched from beside him with the poorly disguised amusement of someone who is genuinely fond of the person they are watching and cannot prevent this fondness from competing with their appreciation of the situation's comedy. The strong exterior light beyond them was the light of the Roman Forum, which in the paintings of the Grand Manner tradition was always somewhat stronger than actual light because the Forum deserved a light that matched its civic significance, and into this light the young man was about to walk with his toga arranged in the configuration of a man who had decided to prioritize the concealment of a haircut over the conventional expectations of toga arrangement, and his companion was going to walk beside him, and neither of them was going to say anything about it. The second barber was considerably more experienced than the first, and he demonstrated this by saying nothing for a longer period than less experienced barbers could sustain before beginning to gesture at the head in front of him with the professional certainty of a man whose diagnosis has been formed and is being communicated through his hands rather than his mouth. The first barber stood slightly apart, not far enough to be outside the scene but at the distance of a professional who is receiving a collegial assessment of his work and is deciding how to receive it, and the bronze tools laid out on the marble table between the two barbers and the nobleman had the quality of surgical instruments in a consultation, objects that would be used or not used depending on decisions that were still being made in the warm atrium light. The nobleman watched both barbers examining his head from different angles with the expression of a man who is grateful for the consultation while being aware that the consultation is itself a form of documentation of a problem. In the corridor, the two slaves crouched with the specific posture of conspirators in a building that was hostile to conspiracy, their bodies at the angles that the corridor's architecture demanded if they were to remain below the sight lines of anyone who might pass the corridor's end. Fear and suppressed laughter existed in their faces in the exact proportions of a situation that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely absurd in equal measure, the proportion between them shifting slightly as each of them looked at the other and then away again in the rhythm of people who are trying not to laugh and are making each other worse. The cool corridor light was the light of interiors that do not face the sun directly, the light of back passages and service routes, and beyond where they crouched the warm room light was visible as a strip under the door, the room where the problem existed, where the master was currently in the process of encountering what they had done to him. The wife with her fingers spread across her husband's head had achieved a position of access to the problem that the husband himself could not achieve without the mirror, and from this position, standing behind the chair in which he sat obliviously with his scroll, in the warm afternoon light that came down through the compluvium and made the impluvium shimmer in the background, she was performing an assessment of comprehensive detail, her fingers not touching the hair but hovering above it, in the specific configuration of a woman who has not yet touched the problem because touching it would constitute admitting the problem exists and she is not yet ready to constitute that admission publicly. Her expression of wifely suffering was the expression of a woman who had built an entire domestic life with a specific person and had therefore developed, over the years, a very precise vocabulary for various categories of disappointment, and this particular category, the category that existed at the intersection of vanity, bad professional judgment, and the public consequences of both, had its own expression that she wore now with the resigned fluency of long practice. The emperor's ornatrix had performed this particular ceremony before, not in this room with this emperor, but in rooms with people of comparable authority, and she knew therefore that the ceremony had a structure and that the structure required her to be on her knees in the specific way in which she was currently on her knees, which was the way of a person for whom kneeling is not humiliation but position, for whom the floor-level relationship to the person above is the professional relationship and contains within it all the dignity that any professional relationship can contain. The emperor's face was an unreadable mask of cold authority, which was to say it was the face the emperor wore when reading dispatches from provinces where things had gone wrong, The face he wore when presiding over proceedings where the outcome was already determined. The face that was itself a form of power and that exercised power by its very unreadability. The Praetorian guards visible in the soft background behind the marble throne were the architecture of authority made human. Three barbers offering contradictory advice at the same volume in the warm Tansrina interior created a sound environment that the fourth man at the center of the consultation was navigating with the expression of someone crossing a river in flood, who has received three different opinions about the best ford, and has not yet determined which opinion to dismiss first. Each barber had hold of the situation with the specific confidence of craftsmen who have identified a problem and know the solution, and each solution was geometrically incompatible with the other two, and each was being communicated with the hands, gestures around the client's head, gestures across the top of the head, gestures that indicated left, gestures that indicated right, with the enthusiasm of professionals who have not yet been required to defend their position against the specific objections of the other two positions. The client's expression of overwhelmed confusion was a precise condition. Neither funny nor unfunny, but simply the experience of having too much information in a space too small for it. The schoolboy arrived at his rhetoric class with the morning light finding him from the left, which was the side that had been cut with the greater of the two available precisions, and sat down in the marble schoolroom colonnade with the precision of someone attempting to position themselves in a manner that presents the better side at the best possible angle relative to the rhetoric master's sightline. The rhetoric master was mid-gesture when the boy entered, his hand raised in the expressive mid-arc of a point being made about Cicero or the structure of the periodic sentence or some principle of argument that was now competing for his attention with the new information presented by the boy's head. The pause in the gesture was brief. The master was a professional. But the classmates were not professionals and their heads were turning in the specific rotation of a group of children responding to visual information of interest. And the boy's mortified face in the warm morning sidelight was the face of someone who had hoped the geometry of entry would be sufficient and had discovered that it was not. The Roman woman with the scented oil was applying it to her own hair at the dressing table with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has made a plan and is executing the plan with the belief that the execution will produce the intended result, which is to say with the belief that scented oil applied to hair that has been cut too short will, through some principle that sits between aesthetics and optimism, persuade the hair to behave as though it has not been cut too short. The bronze mirror showed her the progression of the plan with the bronze mirror's customary impartiality, and the two slaves in attendance held their jars and combs at the prescribed distances and the correct angles, and the room's warm amber light fell across everything with the warm amber light's customary generosity, and the result in the mirror was what it was, a woman with scented, shorter than intended hair that smelled considerably better than it had 5 minutes ago. At the triclinium dinner party, the man on the couch had not yet realized that the man 2 couches to his left was not listening to him. This was a failure of social perception that the warm lamplight of the triclinium was somewhat enabling by distributing its glow with democratic generosity across the full arrangement of reclining figures, so that the man on the left could conduct his private inspection of the right side of the speaker's head without the inspection being visible in any light that the speaker could access. The third guest, positioned between them, was receiving the whispered commentary with the lateral evasion of someone trying to maintain the appearance of attending to the speaker while also receiving whispered lateral information, and this triangular configuration, speaker, inspector, intermediary, had the warm richness of triclinium lamplight and the animated quality of dining figures engaged in the complicated social performance of a Roman dinner party at its most vivid. The tonsor who accepted extra payment did so with the 2-finger technique of a professional receiving coins he has decided to consider deserved rather than to treat as an apology. His fingers closed around the coins with the delicate precision of a man who handles small objects for a living, and the exaggerated humility of his expression. The slight bow of the head, the downward orientation of the eyes, the small compressed smile, was the exaggerated humility of someone who has just received confirmation that the judgment he was defending has been ratified by the person in the strongest position to ratify it, which is to say the person who paid. The client was already leaving. He moved through the warm street-level composition with the posture of a man who had decided the haircut was acceptable, and the Roman passers-by around him continued their own Roman business without pausing to confirm or deny this decision. The public baths received the man with the bad haircut in the way that the public baths received everything, in steam and heat and the particular warm light of marble and water that made everything visible and simultaneously made nothing private. His bathing companions were arranged around him in the various positions of men, who have been bathing together long enough to be in various stages of the bathing process when the new information arrived, and their reactions occupied the range between the polite silence of men, who would not comment because commenting was not what Romans of their particular standing did, and the barely stifled laughter of men, who were losing the competition between their manners and their response to what they were seeing. The steam of the Roman thermi moved through the scene in slow, warm currents, softening the marble and tile detail into the gentle haze that good thermi scenes in the grand manner tradition always produced. The civic crown was oak leaves, and it solved the problem in the way that certain problems in Rome were solved, which was by introducing something that was so clearly of higher civic significance that the problem underneath it ceased to have independent existence in the public perception. The Roman official wore it at the precise angle of civic seriousness, his expression of rigid dignity communicating to the surrounding officials in profile that this was a ceremonial occasion of the appropriate gravity, and that any observation beyond the ceremonial was unnecessary. The marble public building steps in the bright outdoor Roman light were the steps that many Roman ceremonies had descended, and this ceremony was descending them in the correct formation, and the civic crown was in the correct position, and if the position was slightly more precisely calibrated than civic crowns were usually positioned, this was simply the conscientiousness of a man who took his civic duties seriously. The soldier examining the polished shield with disbelief had the weathered face of a man who had been in places where the absence of mirrors was a professional condition and had learned to manage his appearance through the responses of other soldiers, which was not a system that had prepared him for the specific experience of seeing himself clearly in polished metal after several months of managed approximation. The military barber had approached the overgrown campaign hair with what the soldier had taken for confidence and what had turned out, in the evidence now visible in the polished shield, to be something other than confidence. The military camp tent background gave the scene its appropriate military texture. The ropes, the canvas, the equipment of a campaign that had other, more pressing concerns than the quality of its haircuts, but that was nonetheless producing them. The friend who held the elaborate hairpiece next to the disaster was holding it with the specific angle of someone who wants the comparison to work, who is invested in the comparison's success because the alternative is a continuation of the friend's distress, and who is tilting the hairpiece and then the friend's head and then the hairpiece again with the optimistic empiricism of a person who believes that the right angle will resolve the problem. The friend with the disaster was beginning, with the careful visible increments of someone allowing themselves to be convinced, to see something in the comparison that might function as a possibility, which was a different condition from the one she had been in 5 minutes earlier, and the warm feminine interior with its fabrics and its bronze mirror was receiving this transition with the gentle encouragement of rooms that had seen women comfort each other many times. The barber slave being lectured by the household steward was standing at attention with the posture that had been trained into him as the appropriate posture for receiving formal communication in the household setting. His spine at the correct angle, his hands at the correct position, his eyes at the correct elevation, which was slightly below the steward's eye level, acknowledging the steward's position in the household hierarchy without abjectly dropping the gaze below the level of professional engagement. The steward was speaking with the specific rhythm of someone delivering a prepared communication, and the ruined hair on the brush on the floor was the evidence to which the steward gestured periodically, the documentary exhibit in a proceeding that was both formal and domestic and was neither precisely enough to have a single appropriate set of rules. The cool interior corridor light fell across both figures with the impartiality of light that does not take sides. He realized it mid-sentence. The forum was full, the morning crowd moving through the columned exterior space in its daily configurations, and he had been speaking, making a good point, a point about the grain supply or the road in the south that needed attention or something else of civic importance. And mid-sentence the direction of his interlocutor's gaze had changed by a fraction of a degree that he was not intended to notice. The interlocutor's gaze had moved upward, not far upward, not the dramatic upward of a person looking at the sky. The very specific, very brief, very guilty upward of a person who has been looking at a haircut and has been caught looking at a haircut and is now attempting to look at the person whose haircut they were examining as though the examination was not occurring. He finished the sentence. He finished it with full rhetorical form and correct emphasis, because he was a Roman and finishing sentences correctly was something that Romans did regardless of the discoveries made mid-sentence. But the sentence tasted different from the inside now. The warm exterior colonnade light and the civic building behind him were unchanged. The tiring girl being ordered to begin again stood before her mistress with the composure of someone for whom the phrase beginning again represented a specific physical and temporal investment that she was currently calculating. An hour of work. The pins all placed. The arrangement all considered and executed with the techniques she had been taught and the ones she had developed herself through practice, the ones she considered her best work. And the mistress's face looking at the result in the mirror with the expression that the mistress wore when something had failed to become what she had required it to become. An expression the tiring girl could have reproduced from memory, having seen it many times. The warm dressing room light fell across the hour of work and the expression that was requiring it to be undone, and across the tiring girl's composed hands beginning to unpin the first pin, which was the opening act of a process that would eventually become the second attempt. The scroll about symmetry had been produced from somewhere in the marble garden setting with the alacrity of a man who has been waiting for the right conversational moment to deploy it, and now 3 Roman men were arranged around the marble bench reading it or gesturing with it or using it as a pointer toward the portions of their own arguments that the scroll was being cited to support. The fundamental philosophical question, whether one side of a head can be described as shorter than the other if the measurement standard against which both sides were being compared was itself contingent and provisional, had been elevated by the 3rd man in the group into a matter of epistemological significance that none of the other 2 had anticipated when they sat down, and the outdoor portico was now receiving a treatise-level argument about what bad haircuts philosophically were, in the warm afternoon light of a Roman garden that had presumably not expected this. The relatives arrived with their polite masks in the good order, but the masks were fighting a losing battle against the actual information being presented to them by the boy, who stood in the bright atrium light from above with his ruined home haircut and his mother's determined smile beside him, and the particular helplessness of a child, who is aware that the adults in the room are managing feelings about him but cannot identify which feelings or why. The relatives proceeded through the standard pleasantries with the discipline of people who understood that pleasantries were a form of social infrastructure, and that the infrastructure needed to be maintained even during emergencies. And one by one the polite masks slipped by the smallest available increments. The eyebrow, the corner of the mouth, the slight inhalation that precedes a comment and is suppressed before the comment forms, and the mother's smile alongside her son's oblivious confidence became, in the atrium light with the marble floor and the impluvium behind them, a study in the different kinds of courage that Roman domestic life required. The slave companion's whisper had the urgency of someone delivering information that is simultaneously critical and extremely limited in its actionability, which is the most frustrating category of information. He was gesturing at the offending side with the specific hand motion of someone pointing at a problem without touching the problem, because touching the problem in the middle of a columned hall with the important meeting waiting was itself a new problem, and the man frozen mid-stride was frozen in the specific way of someone who has received important information and is performing the rapid calculation of what the information means for the next 10 minutes of his life. He could turn around. He could cover the side. He could go forward with the information and manage its consequences. The warm afternoon light through the open colonnades illuminated all 3 options with equal generosity. The matron with the terrible haircut walked through her household morning duties with the specific quality of presence that Roman women of her standing developed. A presence that was both comprehensive and selective, that was aware of everything in the room and had decided what each thing was worth acknowledging. The slaves following behind her maintained the neutral expressions of professionals who had been in this household long enough to understand that the correct response to a situation the matron had decided not to acknowledge was precisely the same non-acknowledgement that the matron was practicing, so that the whole household moved through the morning in a shared performance of not seeing that was itself a form of seeing the haircut and agreeing together, without a word spoken, to see something else instead. The warm domestic atrium light from above showed everything. The tonsure with the folded hands had performed the perfect performance of professional contrition. The head bowed to exactly the angle that communicated genuine regret without constituting admission of legal liability. The hands folded with exactly the pressure that indicated humility without weakness. He had been in this position before. Not with this client. The client was new to his chair, which was part of the problem. But he had been in this position with the bronze mirror being held before him as evidence, with the folded hands, with the head at its precise angle, and he had navigated those previous positions and he would navigate this one. The warm street tonsarina setting gave the scene its public quality, its exposure to the passing city, and the client held the bronze mirror with the expression of a prosecutor who has presented all the evidence and is waiting for the court to acknowledge the obvious. The senator arriving at the curia with the unusual hat had arrived with it at the specific angle and pace that suggested the hat was a permanent feature of the senator's presentation rather than a response to an emergency, And he was maintaining this suggestion through the lobby's marble columns with the discipline of a man who had decided that the best way to handle a secret was to wear it with such confidence that the confidence itself became the visible thing and the secret receded into its shadow. His colleagues' eyebrows performed their single controlled ascent at the moment the hat was briefly lifted. The hat lifted at the particular angle of a man checking that his hat was correctly positioned, the hat's interior momentarily visible, the situation under the hat momentarily available. And then the hat was replaced and the senatorial pace continued, and the marble Senate chamber columns received the whole transaction with the institutional gravity of a building that had seen senators manage larger problems than this. The hair-slave building structure over absence had arrived at the creative challenge of the bad haircut from the direction of an engineer who has been told that the bridge is fine and has only then been shown what fine means in this context. She was working with the iron wavesetter, which produced texture where there was insufficient length for texture and depth where there was insufficient volume for depth, and the woman watching her in the mirror was watching with the cautious optimism of someone who has been disappointed before and is managing the new hope carefully to prevent it from becoming another disappointment. The warm golden lamp light of the ornate Roman dressing room fell across the iron and the hair and the careful hands and the mirror with the quality of light that paintings of this tradition always reserved for their most technically precise moments. The gladiator had requirements. This was the fundamental quality of the situation. The gladiator had requirements about his appearance on the day of the games, and the prison barber had produced something that did not meet those requirements, and the specific contest between the gladiator's requirements and the barber's assessment of his own capabilities was being conducted in the cell interior with the gladiator's considerable physical authority on one side and the barber's professional resignation on the other. The barber's calm insistence that he could do no better was the calm of a man who had made peace with his limitations and was not going to be moved from that peace by physical intimidation, however impressive the muscles of the person providing the intimidation. The arena sounds coming from beyond the cell, the crowd, the preparation, the distant machinery of spectacle, implied the context in which the gladiator's requirements existed and gave them the specific urgency of proximity. The letter of complaint had been in progress for some time when the scene opened, and its progression was visible in the several lines already filling the tablet and in the expression of the man writing it, which was the focused expression of someone engaged in the construction of a document they consider important. Roman literacy, when deployed on personal grievance, produced a particular kind of prose, precise, formal, rhetorically structured, building its case through the accumulation of specific detail in the manner of legal argumentation. And the man writing this letter was deploying that prose with the full investment of a Roman who took seriously both his own dignity and the mechanisms of accountability. His slave stood holding the inkwell with the posture of an assistant who has been holding things for a long time and has learned to make the holding position sustainable. The afternoon light in the Roman tablinum fell on the already long letter with the patient light of an afternoon that did not intend to leave before the letter was finished. The most expensive tonsrix in Rome was already being summoned before the matron had finished the sentence, because the steward in the background had identified the trajectory of the sentence early enough to begin the summoning while the sentence was still completing itself. The steward's face in the warm triclinium interior showed the rapid calculation of a professional managing priorities in an environment where priorities were changing faster than they could be formally communicated. The tonsrix being summoned was of the caliber that required the summons to be a different kind of summons from the kind used for ordinary tradespeople. The summons that included the level of the household issuing it, the nature of the work required, and the implicit confirmation that the compensation would match both the urgency and the excellence. The strong social hierarchy in the composition was the composition's real subject, the human architecture that arranged the figures in their relative positions and kept them there. The friends at the dinner party had formed a committee around the haircut with the spontaneous efficiency of Roman men, who were accustomed to forming committees, and who found in the formation of committees a natural expression of both their social intelligence and their appetite for collaborative assessment. The man in the center had mentioned it. This was the mistake. He had mentioned it in the manner of someone who expects the mention to resolve the matter quickly and move the evening forward, and the committee had formed instead, and now each member of the committee had a different diagnosis and a different proposed intervention, and the man in the center of the lamplight had the expression of someone who regrets the decision to mention it more profoundly with each passing moment. The warm lamplight on multiple faces was the lamplight of a Roman dinner party at its most vivid and most fully itself. The barber with the thread was presenting a proof. He had stretched the length of thread between 2 points, one on each side of the client's head, and was presenting the equal lengths as evidence that the cut was, in fact, equal. The thread itself was a length of measuring thread of the kind used in workshops and at construction sites, and its presence in the tonsrina was the tonsor's improvised answer to the client's persistent skepticism, an answer that was simultaneously technically creative and ultimately inadequate, because the client was squinting at the evidence with the expression of someone who had already seen the cut in the bronze mirror and understood that the thread's equality was not the same as the cut's equality, and the other customers watching the proof unfold were watching with the entertained attention of people observing a demonstration that has taken a turn they did not predict. The bad haircut that was actually fashionable this season was a revelation of the specific Roman kind that involved the rearrangement of a person's entire assessment of their situation in the light of new information. The slave had produced a bust, one of the portrait busts that sat in the atrium of this house and every house of its kind, rendered in pale marble with the confident, conventional symmetry of official representation, and on the bust was a cut that bore, in the warm marble atrium, a relationship to the cut on the man's actual head that was changing his expression from embarrassment to something more complex, something that required several seconds of assessment before it could be named. Vindicated pride was the eventual result. The transition between the two conditions, the embarrassment and the vindicated pride, was the painting's specific subject, the moment in which a person's relationship to their own appearance undergoes a revision as complete and as rapid as any reversal available to a Roman citizen. The noblewoman at the banquet had brought the kind of haircut to the evening that required the other guests to form an opinion about it, and the guests were forming that opinion in the warm triclinium lamplight with the specific social intelligence of people who understood that an opinion expressed as the wrong opinion in the wrong company had consequences, and were therefore conducting a preliminary assessment of what the right opinion was before committing to it publicly. Around the reclining dinner figures the conversation held the usual density of a Roman banquet's topics, the political, the personal, the philosophical, but these topics were all performing their usual social functions at reduced capacity because the question of whether the noblewoman's haircut was catastrophic or avant-garde was the room's actual subject, and the noblewoman was smiling inscrutably in the warm lamplight as though she had designed the ambiguity herself, which was not impossible. The man examining his reflection in the impluvium pool had discovered what the surface of still water could do for a reflection, which was to introduce into it a subtle, pleasing distortion that the polished bronze mirror, with its commitment to accuracy, declined to provide. The water's surface in the afternoon light gave the reflection a slight depth, a slight wavering, a slight softening of the specific angles that had been the morning's difficulty, and the man crouching at the water's edge in the warm atrium light from above was studying this version of himself with the growing appreciation of someone who has found, after a morning of unflattering truth, a flattering approximation. It was not quite the truth. He knew it was not quite the truth. But it was a truth he could work with, a truth that showed him the general situation from a slightly different angle, and he was prepared to work with it. The Roman soldier tying a band of cloth around his head at the military gathering was performing a version of the togafold maneuver applied to military context, using the materials available in the military context, cloth, binding, whatever could be tied, to solve a problem that the military context had created and that the military context's own limited resources had been unable to solve. His comrades exchanged glances with the lateral, minimal communication of soldiers who have developed shared reference systems over long campaigns and can communicate complex assessments in a quarter-second. The general watching from the raised position had the unreadable expression that generals developed from years of needing to maintain the appearance of unreadability, and whether the unreadability contained amusement or assessment or command was impossible to determine from any position available to the soldiers in the scene. The woman with the iron pins was building architecture. She had assessed the problem with the eyes of an engineer who had been given a brief that the structure must appear to have no brief, that the result must look like a natural arrangement of hair rather than the solution to a technical problem created by someone else's shears, and she was proceeding with the methodical intelligence of an engineer who understands that the best engineering is invisible. The warm lamp light of the Roman dressing chamber showed each pin being placed, each pin chosen from the succession that the slave held toward her with an attention that was also a form of collaboration, and the mirror showed the accumulation of the work, the structure rising over the absence, the shorter section being redistributed upward and outward by the precise tension of the iron pins, the general effect beginning to cohere into something that could be described, with effort, as a style. The teenager submitted to the grandmother's authority with the specific stillness of a 16-year-old who has correctly assessed that resistance is not currently a viable strategy. She moved around him with the absolute authority of a woman for whom hair was a matter of family dignity and family dignity was a matter of civilization and civilization was a matter worth defending with shears in a warm domestic interior. And the correction she was performing on what the original tonsor had done was the correction not just of a haircut but of an affront. A visible, social affront that had sent her grandson into the world in a condition that she personally found unacceptable. And that she was personally correcting. The boy's stillness was not resigned. It was tactical. The discovery in the friend's bronze mirror that the haircut looked different from different angles was a discovery that opened into successive discoveries, each one accessed by a small rotation of the head, each new angle revealing a relationship between the cut and the light or the cut and the viewer's position that was its own fresh assessment of a situation the man had thought he had already assessed. The friend was watching with increasing concern the way one watches someone encountering a problem that grows rather than resolves with each examination, and the warm afternoon room light with the garden visible through the window was the light of a domestic afternoon that had not expected to become a tutorial in the multiple perspectives available on a single bad haircut. The body slave combing the elaborate pattern had the concentration of a military strategist not because military strategy and hair arrangement were comparable activities, but because the specific kind of intelligence required, the ability to work from a current unsatisfactory state to a desired future state through the coordinated management of multiple variables simultaneously, was the same intelligence, applied to different materials. The man watching in the bronze mirror was watching with cautious hope, which was the correct and sustainable version of hope for this kind of situation. Hope that did not invest too much, that could absorb setbacks without collapse, that kept its provisional nature visible as a structural feature. The warm morning light on both faces was the light of a morning where everything depended on the next few minutes. The philosopher's argument that physical appearance was vanity was being delivered in a marble garden setting with the full rhetorical tools of someone who had been making this argument professionally for decades and had refined it to its current elegance through long practice. The cloth that the slave was simultaneously adjusting around the philosopher's own head was an irony that the philosopher had either not noticed or had decided to incorporate into the argument as a demonstration of the argument's real subject, which was not the irrelevance of appearance but the difficulty of living according to the principles one articulates. The student struggling to maintain a straight face was struggling with the gap between the philosophy and its context, which was the gap that philosophy always existed in and that philosophy's most honest students always found the most interesting feature of their subject. He was describing the desired haircut with his hands around his own head, a method of communication that was simultaneously the most direct available, showing rather than telling, presenting the spatial information in 3 dimensions, and the most subject to misinterpretation, because hands moving around a head produced a range of gestural shapes that each passed through several possible meanings on its way from intention to completion. The barber followed with growing skepticism, his own hands not moving but his eyes tracking the client's gestures with the specific attentiveness of a professional who has been receiving hand gesture descriptions of desired haircuts for many years and has learned to identify, early in the process, which client's gestures were communicating something that could be achieved, and which were describing something that lived only in the client's internal representation of their own ideal head. The toga fold before the important meeting was an engineering solution to a social problem, and the body slave watching its application with professional admiration was watching with the admiration of someone who had seen many toga arrangements in many colonnaded corridors and recognized this one as a creative deployment of the toga's conventional functions in service of an unconventional requirement. The toga could cover. This was one of its functions. It covered the body, it defined the social person wearing it, it communicated through its arrangement the wearer's attention to the forms of Roman social presentation. Today it was covering something more specific than usual, and the marble floors of the colonnade reflected the arrangement's lower half with the marble floor's customary objectivity. The woman ordering the process to start again from scratch was exercising the specific authority of someone who pays for the result and has not received the result she paid for, and the tiring girl beginning to unpin the work of an hour was doing so with the specific hands of someone dismantling a project they are professionally proud of because the professional relationship requires it. Each pin coming out reversed a minute of careful placement. Each undone arrangement was the visible record of an investment being liquidated. The mistress's expression was implacable because the implacable expression was the correct expression for the requirement, and the warm dressing room light fell across the hour of work being dismantled and the implacable expression with equal, uncritical attention. The man frozen mid-form speech realized the social situation with the specific cognitive disruption of someone whose train of thought has been derailed by information arriving from outside the train. He was mid-argument, past the exordium, well into the narration, building toward the confirmatio, and the information about his interlocutor's gaze arrived like a late dispatch and required him to manage two simultaneous cognitive operations. The continuation of the rhetorical argument, which was public and committed and could not be stopped mid-execution without consequence, and the processing of the new private information, which was that the person he was arguing with was currently more interested in the side of his head than in the argument. He continued. He was Roman. He continued and he finished and the confirmatio landed exactly as planned, and then he stood in the warm outdoor colonnade light with the civic building behind him and the haircut he had been carrying since dawn still there, and the argument was over and the information remained. At the public baths, the man who saw his mirror image problem in his companion's head performed the specific social calculation of unexpected solidarity, the calculation that occurs when one person's private difficulty is revealed to be a shared difficulty and the revelation changes the nature of the difficulty. They caught each other's eye in the warm steamy thermi interior with the mutual recognition of two people who have been similarly wronged by the same agency, and the recognition contained within it a form of relief, not that the haircut was better, but that it was not unique, that the crime had been committed elsewhere and the commission of it elsewhere was a form of evidence that had implications for where the fault resided. The warm, steamy background of the Roman thermi dissolved the marble and tile detail into a comfortable suggestion of heat and public intimacy. The senator who declared his haircut the result of morning custom was receiving from his slave the best piece of advice available in the situation, which was the advice that took the worst social reading of the visible facts and provided it with an alternative narrative that the facts could technically support. Morning custom in Rome was visible, was publicly legible, was a recognized condition that explained a specific range of appearances that departed from the ordinary standards of Roman personal presentation, and a bad haircut that fell within the visible range of morning-related appearances could be given the morning narrative with sufficient authority to survive polite social scrutiny. The senator considered the advice in the columned interior with the expression of a man recognizing the pragmatic elegance of a solution that had not originated with him. The physician consulted about the medical explanation for the uneven haircut approached the scalp with the diagnostic gravity of a profession that had learned to present gravity as competence, to slow the examination's pace to the pace of thoroughness, to ask questions whose purpose was less the gathering of information than the demonstration of the act of gathering it. The patient hoping for medical absolution was hoping with the specific hope of someone who wants the diagnosis to be the alibi, who wants nature to have produced the problem so that the barber did not, and the warm consulting room interior with its medical implements on a shelf was receiving the examination with the ambient atmosphere of a room in which the gap between what was true and what would be helpful was frequently negotiated. The portrait bust commission with the request to emphasize the better side of the head was a negotiation between vanity and art that took place in the marble atelier in studio light, marble dust visible in the air, the sculptor holding his tools in the preliminary position of a craftsman who has received a brief and is deciding how to receive the brief's implications. To execute the commission as given, to sculpt only the good side, to select the angle of the permanent record, was a kind of collaborative fiction between subject and sculptor, a fiction that the portrait bust tradition had room for and that the sculptor's professional neutrality was equipped to accommodate without judgment. He received the instruction with the professional neutrality. He adjusted his tools. The marble dust continued its slow distribution through the studio light. The summons at midnight had brought the tonsor to the wealthy household with his tools in the lamplight and the urgency of an emergency professional call that had no name in the guild's official record of services, but that every experienced tonsor understood as a real category. The household slave who had summoned him was equally exhausted, having been the instrument of the summons, dispatched at the hour when the household had recognized that the morning ceremony was close enough that the morning could no longer correct what the previous afternoon's cut had started. The dramatic night lamp lighting of the scene gave everything it touched a quality that daytime light never produced. The sharp edge between the lit and the unlit, the warm amber of the lamp against the cool dark of the household corridor, the tonsor's face arriving out of the dark into the light with his tools. The street urchins in the crowded market scene had the specific social freedom of children who have not yet been trained into the Roman adult performance of not noticing, and they deployed this freedom with the creative precision of children who have identified a target and are conducting their commentary with the maximum possible entertainment value for their audience of each other. The richly dressed man maintained his dignified pace through the market with the specific quality of a person who has made a decision, in the moment of first hearing the commentary, that the decision of not acknowledgement is the decision that dignity requires and that dignity is worth maintaining even at the cost of walking through a running commentary at the normal pace of a man with important business elsewhere. His face, going slightly red, told the truth that his pace refused to. The man at the temple with the discreet prayer was performing the private version of public ceremony. The personal request embedded in the formal procedure, the private petition enclosed in the ritual form, the specific entreaty for divine assistance with the specific problem being carried to the gods under the general umbrella of the day's formal devotion. The temple interior with its strong overhead light from the oculus received the prayer with the institutional grandeur of a space designed to make the gap between the human request and the divine capacity feel manageable, and the smoke from the sacrifice moved upward through the oculus light with the patient, upward intention of smoke that knows where it is going even if the person sending it does not. The woman going back to the mirror after being told the light had changed was making the experiment with the genuine openness of someone who had been told something true enough to deserve testing. Light changed. This was a verifiable fact. The morning light that came through the atrium windows was different from the midday light that came through the compluvium and different again from the afternoon light that came through the garden colonnade. And each light had its own quality of warmth and angle and its own relationship with the specific colors and shapes it fell upon. She went to the mirror in the different light with the small careful hope of someone who has managed her expectations sufficiently to test them honestly, and the light on the mirror surface was genuinely different, and the result in the mirror was genuinely changed from what it had been in the previous light, and whether changed meant better was the question that her expression was in the middle of answering. The man counting days on the wax tablet was conducting the arithmetic of waiting with the specific patience of a Roman who had been trained in the stoic management of circumstances beyond his control, and was applying that training now to the question of hair growth with the same disciplined focus he might apply to any matter of civic or domestic resource management. He knew the approximate rate. He had estimated the deficit. He was performing the calculation that produced the date on which the deficit would be remedied by the natural process, and he was recording that date in the wax with the stylus's deliberate strokes, and the scrolls and tablets around him in the warm private study interior were the context of a mind accustomed to the management of information, now managing the information of his own inconvenience with characteristic Roman method. The woman with the iron comb heating in the charcoal brazier had explained the mathematics of the situation to her slave with the clarity of someone who had been living with the mathematics for several days and had refined the explanation through repeated internal rehearsal until it was as precise as the problem required. The barber's shears had achieved in a single session what the iron would require 7 passes to undo, and the iron was going to make those 7 passes regardless of what the evening had planned, because the alternative to the 7 passes was an 8th day of the current situation, and the current situation had run its full allocation of days. The slave received the explanation with the multiple nods of someone memorizing technical instructions while simultaneously managing the brazier's temperature, the iron's position in the coals, and the correct angle for the first application, which was an angle the mistress had specified and which the slave had already committed to memory while the explanation was still in progress. The man examining his face in the polished silver salver being carried past him in the street had the specific quality of presence that people achieve in the half-second between seeing themselves unexpectedly in a reflective surface and registering what they are seeing. The salver was moving, being carried by a slave on his way somewhere with the purposeful pace of an errand, and the reflection was moving with it, so that the examination had to be conducted at the pace of the salver's transit. The man's eyes locked to the moving surface with the tracking focus of someone trying to read a text that is being carried past him. He had stopped mid-step. His right foot was still raised. The slave carrying the salver had stopped too, because the chain from the reflection to the freezing of the man to the stopping of the salver had been completed before the slave had processed it, and now both figures were motionless in the busy Roman street, the salver between them like a mirror that the street had provided without being asked. The describing of the desired haircut to the new tonsure in the tonsurina was already in its 2nd minute when the barber's skepticism reached the level that was visible on his face, the level at which professional politeness was beginning to require more energy to maintain than its earlier, more comfortable version. The client's hands moved around his own head with the gestural vocabulary of someone who has assembled a precise internal image of the desired result and is transferring that image through the medium of gesture into the 3-dimensional space between himself and the barber was tracking the gestures with the patient, experienced eye of a professional who had received many such transfers and who understood that the transfer's success depended not on the clarity of the gestures, but on the shared vocabulary between the gesturing client and the receiving craftsman, and that shared vocabulary was still, at this point in the encounter, under active assessment. The warm Tansrina street setting gave the scene its context. The shop open to the street, the passing city visible beyond, the ordinary Roman morning continuing its business while this particular negotiation found its terms. The woman with the elaborate comb arrangement working from the pin engineering of the first session had moved into the second session with the revised strategy of someone who has assessed the first session's results and identified a different approach. She was performing the comb arrangement with iron pins placed at 7 specific angles, the angles determined not by convention but by the specific geometry of this particular head and this particular deficit, the angles calculated to produce the specific appearance of fullness at the locations where the cut had removed the foundations of fullness. The slave holding the pins with 1 by 1 precision had reached the specific professional state of an assistant who is so well synchronized with their principle that the next pin is already extended before the hand arrives for it, the anticipation of the need making the supply of the need seamless. The warm lamp light on the engineering problem showed every pin and every strand and the patient work of making absence visible as presence. The athlete's ointment was being applied with determination. The woman had researched the ointments available, the ones from the Egyptian quarter that were claimed to encourage follicular activity, the ones from the apothecary near the temple of Asclepius that were pressed from the herbs associated with growth and renewal, the general-purpose scented oils that had no specific medicinal claim but whose application was its own form of active optimism. She had selected the one that smelled most authoritative. She was applying it to the shorter section with the focused intensity of someone who believes in what they are doing at the level required to do it, which is the level at which the belief and the doing are indistinguishable, and the slave recording the instructions for later had her stylus moving with the speed of someone whose principle had found something that might work and that she was going to document in sufficient detail that it could be reproduced. The warm domestic interior received the ointment, the determination, and the recording with equal attentiveness. The older brother's argument was being made from behind, both men visible from behind, looking at the portrait of their father on the wall of the family tablinum, the portrait showing their father at the age at which the baldness had become the permanent condition of his head. The argument structure was simple. The haircut's imperfections were temporary and would resolve themselves by ordinary biological processes, and those biological processes would in any case eventually produce a condition that made the haircut entirely irrelevant. And their father's portrait was the evidence that this condition was the family's inheritance, and therefore the correct response to the current haircut was perspective. The man receiving the argument was receiving it with the expression of someone who finds the argument logically valid and emotionally insufficient simultaneously, which is the condition that logic frequently produces when deployed on emotional problems. The tonsor reading the highly technical letter of complaint with professional resignation was reading it in the way of professionals who have received complaints before and have developed a specific reading posture for them. The slight forward tilt, the eyes moving steadily down the lines without the skips and returns of unsettled reading, the occasional pause that was less reflection than the marking of a new category of grievance. His assistant was trying to read over his shoulder with the curiosity of someone who wants to know the full extent of the situation, and the list of grievances was evidently long enough that it occupied more lines than the assistant could read at the angle available to him. The warm Tansrina morning light gave the scene its professional setting. The tools on the shelf, the chair where the client had sat, the street visible beyond, and the letter in the tonsor's hands was the formal documentation of a professional failure that had been articulated with a Roman's full literary resources. The Greek tonsor from Athens, examining the damage from the elevated perspective of imported excellence, was doing so with the specific quality of assessment that comes from someone who has trained in a tradition that considers itself the standard against which other traditions are measured, and who is examining work done in a tradition that does not entirely share this self-assessment. His hands moved across the damage with the delicacy of fine instruments, his expression containing within its professional gravity a controlled version of the response that the quality of the work called for, a version controlled enough to remain within the range that professional ethics required but precise enough that the nobleman watching could read the assessment without it being spoken. The marble private salon received the examination in the cool light of a room that had been arranged specifically for this purpose. The correct chair, the correct light, the correct tools on their marble surface, and the local barber's failure was visible in what the Greek's hands were doing. The dinner party deflection was in its third deployment of the evening. The first two had been successful. The political subject of the grain supply had landed well, had found purchase in the conversation's appetite for political material, had generated discussion that carried the company past the moment of potential comment. The third deployment was being attempted with the grain supply topic already spent and the conversation having returned, with the slight momentum of conversations that have been redirected and are now finding their natural direction, to the subject of the dinner party's most notable visual feature. The man's expression suggested he was calculating the remaining deflection options with the awareness that each deployment reduced the stock of available topics, and that the stock was not infinite. The warm triclinium lamplight on the reclining figures showed every face involved in the deflection's reception: the politely attended, the amused, the genuinely curious, in the specific detail of a dinner party that was more interesting than its host had planned. The woman who cut all of it short made her decision in the mirror at the moment the decision became available as an option, the moment the shorter section's existence suggested, rather than undermined, a general approach. If the existing cut had produced this particular length on one side, and if that length were applied to the whole, the result would be consistent, and consistency was a virtue that uneven cuts specifically lacked, and the virtue of consistency achieved through radical action had a certain bold quality that the original disaster had not had and that its correction might. She directed the slave with firm gestures, the gestures of someone who has passed through the deliberation and arrived at the execution and is not revisiting the deliberation. The bronze mirror showed the transition from partial disaster to total commitment, and the warm interior light gave the commitment the illumination it deserved. The official's bad review of the tonsor was being composed in the study interior in the specific Roman literary register of the formal written recommendation, the register that employed the language of civic trust and its violation, the language of professional standards and their breach, the language of the community of informed citizens protecting each other from the consequences of inadequate service. He was writing it for a friend, with the authority of personal experience, and the wax tablet was receiving his testimony with the wax tablet's characteristic receptivity. The afternoon light in the study fell across the scrolls and tablets around him and produced the warm amber of a man engaged in the satisfying work of converting private grievance into useful social information. The patron master appearing in the doorway to discover the household barber giving the slave a better cut than he had received was arriving at the conclusion to a sequence of events that the barber had hoped to avoid and was now navigating. The barber's position, caught between the cut he had been giving the slave and the cut he had given the master, was the position of a professional whose inconsistency had been exposed by the visibility of the comparison, and the master's demand to know why the slave's cut was better was a question whose answer required more diplomatic skill than the barber had available at this particular moment in the warm domestic hall light. The slave in the chair had the composed expression of someone who is present in a scene that is not about them and is waiting with professional stillness for the scene to resolve itself. The bathhouse barber's refusal to charge for the repair was a professional statement as much as a financial one. The statement that what the previous barber had done fell outside the range of haircut outcomes that the barber's profession recognized as acceptable departures from the standard, that it was in a category of its own that required its own nomenclature, and that the bathhouse barber's professional ethics prevented him from treating it as a haircut that simply needed improvement when it was technically something that needed reconstruction. The man's expression shifted from simple anger, the anger of the person who had received the cut and had been living with it, to litigious interest, the interest of a Roman who has just been offered a professional opinion that has implications for his options. The warm thermy interior with its marble and water sounds received the shift from victim to potential plaintiff with the impartiality of baths that had seen many such transitions. The mother teaching her daughter to assess the tonsrix before commissioning her was doing so in the outdoor market with the specific pedagogical method of the Roman woman who has learned through experience and is transmitting that experience through practice rather than instruction. They were examining the tonsrix's current clients, the women who had already sat in the chair and were now moving through the market wearing the evidence of the tonsrix's work, and the mother's quiet commentary was the running assessment of a consumer who had developed over years a comprehensive set of criteria for evaluating hair work in progress and in its completed state, and the daughter was receiving the commentary with the attention of someone who understands that this is education of the most practical kind. The outdoor market morning light showed everything that needed to be shown. The man who had decided not to appear in public for a month was communicating this decision to his slave with the specific quality of a person who has made a decision they know is unreasonable and are communicating it as though it were reasonable because the alternative, acknowledging its unreasonableness and either abandoning it or defending it, was worse than the pretense of its reasonableness. The slave was receiving the impossible instructions with the expression of a slave who has received many instructions and has learned to distinguish between the ones that would resolve themselves before they required implementation and the ones that would not, and was categorizing this one as the former while calculating the practical implications of the latter. The warm tablinum interior with its furniture and its architectural logic and its domestic arrangements continued to function as the setting for instructions that its own architecture made difficult. The second bad haircut from the different barber who had promised to correct the first occupied a distinct category. Not worse than the original technically, but differently wrong in a way that produced, in the mirror, a symmetry of error that the original's asymmetry had not had. The man examining the result was moving through the specific cognitive stages of someone encountering an outcome that is not the one they wanted and also not the one they feared, that exists in a third category that their preparation for this moment had not included. The warm Tansrina showed him in the chair with the mirror before him and the new cut on his head, and his expression was working its way toward an accommodation with the result that was different from acceptance but shared its geography. The accommodation of someone who has received an answer to a question he asked and has discovered that the answer resolves something even though it does not resolve it correctly. The woman receiving the compliment that her hair looked fashionably Greek was receiving it from a position of complete ignorance of the compliment's actual basis, which was that the fashion for Greek hairstyles in current Roman society included a style that bore an accidental relationship to what her hair currently did, and that the relationship between what her hair currently did and what fashionable Greek hairstyles did was close enough that a guest who was familiar with Greek fashion could make the connection without knowing that the connection was accidental. She smiled with the gracious composure of someone accepting a compliment about something deliberate, and the mental note forming behind the gracious composure was the mental note of a woman who has just discovered a way forward from a situation she has been managing for several days. The warm triclinium lamplight on the reclining figures showed the complimenter and the compliment's recipient in the warm mutual exchange of a social grace. The man emerging from the barber with the perfect haircut had the specific quality of restored confidence that only someone who has been managing its absence understands, the posture returning to its natural position, the chin finding the angle it occupied before the problem existed, the shoulders settling back from the slight forward compression of the person who is managing a difficulty. He caught sight of himself in a reflective surface on the Roman street. A polished shop front, a bronze door fitting, the surface of a fountain, with the genuine pleasure of recognition, the recognition of the person he was when things were as they should be, and the Roman street exterior in the bright morning light received his re-emergence into full public confidence with the ordinary extraordinary indifference of streets that contain every kind of human condition at every moment and make no distinction between the man who has just solved his problem and the man who has just acquired one. The household celebration when the matron's hair had finally grown back was the small, private feast of a domestic household that has been carrying attention for months and has now been released from it, and the release was visible in the way people moved in the room, with the ease of bodies that are no longer performing the careful management of the tension, with the slightly expanded quality of presences that had been slightly compressed and are now returning to their natural dimensions. The matron's smile at the mirror was the smile of a woman looking at the thing she had been counting days toward, the thing that the wax tablet arithmetic had been projecting into the future for so many weeks, and the domestic atrium with its warm afternoon sunlight from the compluvium was the room in which the counting had finally arrived at its result. The man standing alone in the empty room before the public ceremony was performing a final private version of the assessment before the public version made private assessment irrelevant. He stood before the mirror in the warm atrium light with his hands at his sides and his chin at the angle that the public day would require of it, and the face in the mirror was the face that Rome would see today, and he was looking at it with the look of a man who has done everything available to him and has arrived at the point where the available things are exhausted and what remains is the day itself. The acceptance he was working toward was the specific Roman acceptance that the Stoics had described and that working Romans practiced. Not the acceptance of the defeated but the acceptance of the practical, the acceptance of someone who has correctly identified the boundary of their control and is proceeding in good order beyond it. The couple with matching bad haircuts from the same tonsor were sitting side by side before the shared mirror with the specific quality of a domestic portrait that had not been commissioned but had assembled itself. They had discovered the matching over the course of the morning, the discovery arriving in the incremental way that shared experiences always arrive between people who are close enough to have had the same experience without knowing they were having it simultaneously. Their identical expressions of dignified Roman complaint, the expression that Roman faces wore when receiving an injustice for which the register of emotion was displeasure rather than distress, gave the portrait an unintentional unity, a compositional coherence that the painter had recognized immediately and that the couple, visible in the warm interior afternoon light, were entirely unaware of. The woman beginning to actually like the bad haircut was in a transition that the mirror was documenting with the incremental honesty of bronze surfaces. She had been examining the same mirror for a week. She had examined it with fury on the first day, with strategies on the second and third, with resigned management through the middle days, and today in the warm late afternoon atrium light, she was examining it with the specific forward lean of someone who was seeing something they had not previously seen, and what she was seeing was the cut in the context of her face rather than in the context of what the cut was supposed to have been. This was a different context. In this context, without the comparison to the intended version, without the grievance overlaid on the image, the cut was doing something that she had not permitted herself to notice before, and she was noticing it now with the cautious, provisional interest of someone who is not yet ready to call it good but is no longer prepared to call it only bad. The official dictating the letter of complaint that had achieved the length and complexity of a legal brief was dictating it with the specific energy of a Roman man who has been educated in rhetoric and has found, in the composition of a formal complaint, the natural domain for everything he was taught. The secretary was writing with impressive speed, the stylus moving across the wax with the professional fluency of a man who has taken dictation at this pace before, and whose hand had achieved the independence from his conscious mind that fast transcription requires. The letter was building its case with the formal apparatus of Roman legal argument, the statement of fact, the establishment of expectation, the documentation of the departure from expectation, the assessment of consequence, and the warm tablinum interior with its scrolls and tables and the light falling through the high window was the interior of the Roman civic mind deployed on personal indignity. The man watching the barber work on another client with impeccable skill was watching with the specific attention of someone gathering evidence for a case he had already decided. The other client's cut was proceeding with the calm precision of a professional in full control of his materials, the shears moving in the even rhythm of experience, the comb distributing the hair with the economy of a hand that knew the territory, the result accumulating in the bronze mirror with the organic consistency of work that knows where it is going. The watcher's observation was sharp with the grievance of comparison. This was the same barber, the same chair, the same bronze mirror, the same tools, and the result being assembled before him now in the warm Tonsrina setting was demonstrably different from what had been assembled on his own head. And the difference was the question that the observation was trying, without much success, to answer. The woman presenting herself for a second visit to the same Tonsrix with the diplomatic expression communicating everything without words was practicing the specifically Roman art of the communication that operates through register rather than content. The expression that tells the professional exactly what the client thinks without requiring the client to say it, that allows the social surface of the encounter to remain intact while the actual information moves underneath it through an entirely different channel. The Tonsrix received the communication on its actual channel with the equally diplomatic face of a professional who has received this kind of communication before and understands both its content and the terms under which it is being delivered, and the warm morning professional setting gave both women the light they needed to conduct the exchange with the clarity that each required. The Gallic slave with the beautiful hair was answering the Roman man's question with the specific quality of someone answering a question from above, from higher in the social structure, about something that comes from below, from the provincial tradition, from the regional practice, from the accumulated domestic knowledge of a place that Rome regarded as peripheral. The regional technique was simple. The simplicity was the answer's most important quality, because the Roman man had been approaching his hair with the complexity available to a person with access to Rome's full range of professional and commercial hair services, and the simplicity of the provincial approach was an alternative so structurally different from his own that its validity required a moment of cognitive reorganization. The warm domestic interior with its columns and its fabrics held the social hierarchy's inversion with the patient attention of rooms that have seen hierarchies flex. The votive offering at the household shrine was a small piece of ribbon, the kind used to bind hair, left at the base of the lararium with the careful placement of an offering that the giver wanted the household gods to take seriously. The woman making the offering had the specific quality of someone performing an act of devotion that they are slightly embarrassed to have needed, that sits in the region of the very personal where prayer becomes a confession of the size of the thing prayed about, where the smallness of the request is itself the content of the prayer. The warm lamplit lararium alcove gave the scene the intimacy of domestic religion at its most honest. The devotion offered not in the temple's formal public space but in the household's private alcove, where the gods received the prayers that people could not say in public because they were too small or too specific or too much about hair. The barber documenting the precise instructions on the wax tablet before beginning was conducting the professional ceremony of preemptive agreement. The ceremony that experience had taught him was worth the time it cost because the time it saved in post-cut negotiation was always greater. Both men were reviewing the specifications together. the client tracing with his finger the portions of the tablet that corresponded to the portions of his head, the barber nodding with the nods of a man whose nodding is a professional commitment rather than a conversational convenience, and the elaborate ritual of the review was the ritual of two people who had both been in previous situations that had not included the review and were conducting this one with the specific thoroughness of people who had learned from those situations. The warm Tansrina setting gave the ceremony its professional context. The tools set out, the mirror in position, the morning light correct for the work. The two women discovering in the outdoor market that they had the same disastrous haircut from the same Tunsricks were moving through the specific emotional stages of shared catastrophe with the timing of people who have been friends long enough to track each other's processing in real time. The shared horror arrived simultaneously because they were looking at each other, and the transition from horror to shared laughter was also simultaneous, for the same reason, and the shared laughter had the specific quality of laughter that exists specifically because the situation is bad. The laughter that releases the pressure the badness has been generating, that acknowledges the badness with the full weight of acknowledgement and then converts the weight into something lighter through the shared recognition that the badness is the same badness, that they are in it together. The warm outdoor market morning light fell across both their terrible haircuts with equal generosity. The trusted slave making the final small corrections worked with the focused care of someone performing a task that is both technically simple and consequential. The corrections were small, individual strands repositioned by the warm morning light, small asymmetries addressed with the minimum effective intervention. But the accumulation of small corrections was the difference between barely acceptable and genuinely presentable, and the man in the chair knew this because he was watching the corrections in the mirror with the posture of a man who is gradually relaxing, whose shoulders are descending by the millimeter increment that corresponds to each successful small correction. The slave worked without acknowledgement, without commentary, without the need for direction, because the work was self-directing. Each small correction revealed the next small correction, and the sequence had its own internal logic that the slave followed to its conclusion with the patient concentration of practice competence. The collective relief of the household when the corrected hair emerged from the dressing room was visible in the slave's postures in the warm atrium light from above. The slight relaxation of people who have been standing in a specific way for a specific reason and no longer need to stand in that way. The days of tension had been the tension of a household that orbited its mistress's state of mind the way that smaller bodies orbit larger ones, and the mistress's state of mind had been in the specific configuration that a disastrous haircut produces in a woman of strong aesthetic convictions and significant domestic authority, and the household had been navigating that configuration with the comprehensive alertness of people who understood that their environment's conditions were not fixed and required constant monitoring. Now the conditions had changed. The atrium light from above fell on the corrected hair and on the relaxing postures, and the household breathed. The compliment at the forum from the respected senior senator was arriving at a moment when the man receiving it had already assembled and delivered and revised his private assessment of his own appearance approximately 40 times in the preceding week and had reached, through this extensive process of revision, a conclusion that was neither acceptance nor rejection but something in the ambiguous middle that required only the smallest additional input to tip toward one outcome or the other. The senator's compliment, genuine, specific, the compliment of a man who had strong opinions about the current fashions in men's hair and had found in this particular cut a departure from convention that struck him as bold rather than botched, arrived at exactly this ambiguous middle and tipped it decisively toward vindication. The man's expression performed the recalibration visibly, the entire architecture of his opinion of his own appearance rearranging itself in the warm outdoor colonnade light in the time it took the senator to complete the sentence. The Tunsor at sunset reviewing the day's clients in the warm orange light of the Tansrina was conducting the professional's evening self-assessment with the methodical honesty of someone who had been in the craft long enough to assess without flattery. The particular difficult client was a recurring thought, returning at the intervals that difficult things return, with the persistence of something that the mind has filed under unresolved rather than completed, something that had not yet become the memory it would eventually become. The day's tools cleaned and set aside on their shelf were the evidence of the day's work, and the day's work had been mostly good work and partly difficult work, and the evening light was the light of endings, of the closing of the shop and the settling of accounts, of the professional's private reckoning with the gap between what he had intended and what he had produced. The first morning leaving the house after the hair had grown back was a morning with a different quality in its light, or at least a morning that the man perceived as having a different quality in its light, which was perhaps the same thing. He stepped out of his house into the warm morning street light with the posture of someone who has been reintroduced to the condition of not managing a difficulty. The posture that was not triumphant but was simply the natural posture, the one that required no supplementary support, the one that the body adopted when it was not also holding something else. The slave opening the door performed this function with the ordinary efficiency of a daily act, and the street received the man with the ordinary efficiency of a street receiving one more person in its ordinary morning traffic. But inside the ordinariness was the small return of the thing that had been absent, the small specific happiness of one thing restored. The woman in the final hour before the major social event had been working with 4 different iron implements in the warm lamplight for the period that preceded the hour in the way of people who have accepted that they are going to be at the mirror until the problem is solved and have therefore simply been at the mirror working. The 4 implements each addressed a different scale of the problem, one for the broad general arrangement, one for the mid-level structural decisions, one for the fine corrections at the edges, one for the finishing touches at the specific places where the finishing touches mattered most. And the woman had moved through all 4 in the sequence that her experience of her own hair had taught her was the correct sequence, and the result in the mirror, in the warm lamp light of the final hour, was genuinely beautiful. She looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of problem solved, not the triumphant satisfaction, not the vindicated satisfaction, but the steady, quiet satisfaction of someone who has engaged a difficult problem with everything she had and arrived, through sustained effort and good judgment, at the correct result. The family at the triclinium table, where 3 approaches to the same bad tonsor were simultaneously visible, had the quality of a composition that documented something true without having arranged itself for documentation. The father with his unresolved bad haircut sat at the head of the table in the warm triclinium interior with the expression of a man managing the public dimension of a private difficulty. The mother had covered hers with a veil, which was a solution that the veil's conventional functions as clothing could accommodate without comment, and which she wore with the composed expression of a woman who has found a solution that requires no explanation and has decided that solutions requiring no explanation are the best kind. The son, who had taken matters into his own hands with the kitchen shears and a considerable natural talent that no one had known he possessed, was eating with the private satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem that the adults around him have not solved, and was aware enough of the social dynamics to not draw attention to this. The man standing between 2 tonsor establishments in the warm Roman street exterior with both barbers visible in their doorways was standing at a decision point that was also a memory point, both doorways leading back to specific previous visits, both visits concluding in the kinds of results that had produced the current hesitation. He had the expression of someone performing a comparison whose dataset was composed entirely of negative instances and who was therefore trying to determine not which option was good but which option was least definitively bad, which was a different comparison with a different method and a different kind of required confidence. The Roman urban life in full vivid detail around the decision continued its business. The street vendors, the pedestrians, the sounds of the city at its morning work, and the man stood in the middle of it calculating the acceptable risk. The household tonsor receiving the detailed instruction tablet from the mistress with one hand while the previous result was returned in a piece of cloth with the other was receiving both items simultaneously with the formal accountability of an exchange that the mistress had structured to communicate its own meaning through its structure. The tablet specified. The cloth contained the evidence of what the tablet's previous version had produced. The giving of both simultaneously was the giving of the standard and the documentation of its breach in the same gesture, and the tonsor received both with the professional composure of someone who understood that the exchange was also a warning and was treating it accordingly. The warm atrium midday light fell across the exchange with the matter-of-fact light of rooms that have hosted many accountabilities. The man at the baths telling the stranger about the best tonsor in all of Rome was telling it with the authority that only hard-won knowledge produces, the authority of someone who has arrived at a conclusion through a process that included many wrong conclusions first, who knows the value of the right answer because they paid for it with the wrong ones. He had been leaning over the warm thermi interior with the unsolicited advice posture of someone who has information the other person needs and cannot understand why they do not already have it, and the advice was offered with great authority because the path to it had been long enough to make the destination significant. He had earned the right to this authority through the education of many bad haircuts, and the specific weight of that education was visible in the way he held himself while delivering it. The private garden at the end of the day had a quality of permission in it that the public day had not had, the permission to be the person who had been performing not managing rather than the person who had been performing not caring, And the man touching his own hair quietly in the evening garden light was doing so with the private honesty of someone who is finally alone with the thing that has been accompanying them all day as a managed fact and can now just be the fact without the management. The garden was soft in the evening light with the columns and the foliage and the warmth of a Roman evening that had used up its heat in the afternoon and was now distributing what remained in the gentle, even way of evenings that have no agenda. The private relaxation of no longer performing indifference was its own condition, specific and necessary and available only in private. The man asking for the poem was asking with the diplomatic precision of someone who has identified the service they require and is constructing the commission in the terms that will make the service available at the quality level the situation demands. The poet friend was considering the commission's creative challenges from the position of a man who wrote for patrons and therefore had experience of the conversion of patron reality into patron-adjacent representation, the transformation of the actual into the improved that was the poet's professional contribution to the household's relationship with its own image. The hairstyle that was bold and artistic rather than accidental was a subject that required the poem to be genuinely good, because a mediocre poem about a bold hairstyle was worse than no poem at all. The warm garden portico and the afternoon light on the negotiation between vanity and art held the two men in the specific amber of a conversation about what literature was for. The physician's diagnosis of uneven natural hair growth was delivered with the gravity of a medical judgment that the physician had arrived at through the genuine examination of the scalp. He had looked, with the actual looking of a man who knew what he was looking for, and he had found something that he could honestly identify as a natural feature of the hair's growth pattern, a slight differential in the follicular distribution on one side versus the other that was a genuine biological fact. Whether this fact fully explained the haircut's uneven appearance or merely contributed to it was a question the physician was choosing not to press, because the man sitting before him wanted the medical absolution and the medical facts were sufficient to provide a partial version of it, and a partial version of the absolution was better than none. Both men were pleased to have the natural explanation, and the warm clinical interior received their shared relief with the ambiguous satisfaction of rooms that sometimes housed truths and sometimes housed useful approximations. The barber returning the partial payment was doing so with the specific dignity of a professional acknowledging a professional outcome that fell short of the professional standard while not accepting the characterization that the shortfall was catastrophic. The coins counted onto the marble counter were counted with care, each coin placed rather than dropped, the counting performed audibly, the sum constituted with visible precision, and the counting was itself a statement about the nature of the return. Not a refund but a calibration, not an admission of failure but an adjustment of accounts. The client accepting the partial return was accepting it with the bearing of a Roman accepting tribute that was smaller than deserved, a bearing that acknowledged both the tribute and its inadequacy with the same composed expression, and the street Tonsarina gave the transaction the light it deserved, the ordinary Roman street morning, the open shop front, the city passing by. The woman spending the long morning trying 12 different arrangements of the same bad haircut had the floor around her covered in the abandoned equipment of 11 failed attempts, the discarded pins in their small metal clusters, the combs set down at various stages, the unsuccessful iron implements from the early sessions, and the mirror remained unsatisfactory because the haircut remained what it was, and what it was not 12 different arrangements but one persistent underlying fact that 12 different arrangements were insufficient to fully contain. The slave was exhausted in the specific way of people who have been in sustained professional service to a project that is not resolving, whose efforts have been continuous and competent and have produced 11 results and are now contributing to a 12th with the professional commitment that exhaustion cannot reduce below its minimum. The warm domestic interior comedy of the scene had its own seriousness, the seriousness of a woman and her mirror in a long morning that was not going to end until the mirror and the woman had reached some agreement. The tonsor in his old age reconstructing the worst haircut he had ever given was doing so with the gestures of memory, the hands moving around his own head in the shapes of the cuts and the mistakes, the shapes of the specific wrong decisions that 30 years of subsequent experience had made clear as wrong decisions but that had not been clear at the time, that had seemed at the time like the best available response to a difficult situation. The apprentice listening with professional concern and personal dread was receiving the account with the doubled attention of someone who understands that every story about failure is also a lesson about failure, that the specifics of the worst haircut ever given were the specifics of something to avoid, and that avoiding them required knowing them in sufficient detail. The warm evening Tonsarina closing time light fell on the two of them, the old man and the young one, the story and its listener, in the amber of a day that was ending and an instruction that was just beginning. The woman whose bad haircut was admired by the provincial visitor stood in the warm outdoor meeting of the Roman street with the specific social challenge of a misperception that she had to decide in real time whether to correct. The provincial woman was from a place where the style the bad haircut had accidentally produced was the conventional style, was unremarkable, was the ordinary arrangement of a woman presenting herself for a normal day, and her compliment was entirely sincere, delivered with the friendly authority of someone passing information she thought was useful. The Roman woman, receiving the compliment, was processing simultaneously the pleasure of the compliment and the information that the pleasure rested on a misunderstanding. And the expression she was producing while processing this was the expression that Roman faces produced when the correct response to a situation required the rapid evaluation of competing considerations. The legal possibility dawning at the Thermae was dawning with the specific quality of a Roman man encountering a framework that his situation fits. The bathhouse barber's statement that what the previous barber had done was technically illegal under guild regulations was a statement that arrived in the warm Thermae interior and found in the man's expression a rapid transition from simple anger to the more complex and potentially more productive state of a person who has just discovered that his personal grievance has institutional standing. Rome had regulations. The Barbers' Guild had regulations. The regulations existed because the Senate had found, at some point in the Republic's history, that the quality of haircuts was a matter of sufficient civic importance to warrant formal standards, and those standards had been violated, apparently, and the violation had a legal category, and the legal category had implications. The man's expression was already constructing the implications. The paterfamilias who had prohibited the subject at the family dinner by his own edict was presiding over the table with the specific quality of authority that Roman paterfamilias authority required, the authority that was not performance but position, the authority that existed in the structure of the room rather than in any individual expression. The family was eating in careful compliance with the edict, which is to say they were eating while not saying the specific thing that the edict prohibited, and the careful compliance was itself a form of acknowledgement, the not saying constituting a more elaborate form of saying than the saying would have been. The youngest child who knew nothing of the edict was the composition's moral center, the one figure whose not saying had no component of performed compliance, and the warm triclinium lamplight treated all the figures equally, the complying and the innocent and the presiding, with the democratic amber of a lamp that knew nothing of edicts. The barber completing his finest work and standing back with professional pride was standing in the moment that every craftsman stands in at the end of their best work, the moment before the response, the moment in which the made thing exists in the pure condition of the maker's assessment before the critic's assessment overlays it with a different perspective. He saw what he had done, and he knew it was good, and he was standing in the knowledge of its goodness with the specific satisfaction of a craftsman who had achieved the thing he was trying to achieve and could see the achievement clearly. The client in the mirror was looking and about to speak, and what the client was about to say was going to arrive in the moment that had always been coming, the moment that the tonsor's warm tonsurina interior had been building toward since the first snip, and the painting held the two men in the perfect suspension of the moment before the verdict, and the verdict was unknown. The man whose bad haircut had accidentally started a fashion trend was discovering this in the warm Thermae interior with the expression of someone receiving news that rearranges the entire context of several difficult weeks. 3 other men at the baths were wearing the same cut intentionally, had chosen it from the available cuts, had commissioned it from a tonsor who had confirmed that it was currently fashionable, had presented themselves in public wearing it with the confidence of people who are wearing something fashionable and know they are wearing something fashionable. And the cut was his cut. His accidental cut. His disaster. The transition from embarrassment to unlikely cultural authority was not instantaneous. It moved through several intermediate states, surprise and recalculation and the specific pleasure of discovering that what you have been managing as a problem is actually a distinction, but it completed itself in the warm Thermae light before the men around him had finished their own bathing. The portrait painting after the hair had grown back perfectly showed a man at rest in the warm afternoon light that filled the room with the quality of afternoons that have no particular urgency. Afternoons that exist to be spent in the slow, pleasant work of sitting for a portrait and knowing that what the portrait will record is exactly what you want it to record. The painter worked at the canvas with the focused attention of a craftsman responding to material that was cooperating, the subject composed, the light correct, the room at the right temperature for the paint, and the subject sat with the ease of someone who had no concealment projects and no management strategies and no angle adjustments, who was simply present in his correct appearance in a room full of warm afternoon light, being recorded accurately. The senator in the marble Senate interior who considered telling the story and decided against it was making, in the moment of the decision, one of the small decisions that shape the texture of a public life. He had the perfect haircut now. The story of the bad haircut that had preceded it was the kind of story that humanized its teller, that produced in the listeners the specific warm response of shared recognition. Every man in the Senate had a bad haircut story, and that would have been well received. He knew it would have been well received. And he decided, in the warm directed interior light of the curia, not to tell it, because some stories were better as private possessions than as public performances, because the story of the bad haircut and its resolution was a story that he had earned through the experience of it, and what he had earned he was going to keep. The household barber slave, becoming the most trusted person in the entire household, had arrived at this position through the specific accumulation of consistently excellent haircuts over many years, which was not a small thing in a household where the haircut was a daily fact and the quality of daily facts determined the quality of daily life. He received the small gift from the master with the genuine warmth of someone who understood what the gift meant. Not the gift's monetary value but its relational meaning, its acknowledgement of a skill that was small in the catalogue of the household's activities and significant in the texture of the household's daily experience. The warm atrium afternoon light fell on the exchange with the generosity of light that had seen this household through many seasons and understood that the loyalty that comes from being well served in small things was a particular kind of loyalty, steady and specific and not easily replaced. The toast at the dinner table was raised to a tonsor whose name the razor did not know. The unknown barber who had finally given him the cut he had been seeking for years, the cut that he had described to many barbers and received from none of them until this one, who had listened with the precise attention of someone who was actually going to do the thing that had been described, and had then done it with the competence of someone who had understood the description correctly. His companions joined the toast without understanding its specific content, raising their cups in the triclinium lamplight with the warm solidarity of people who join toasts when toasts are raised among friends, and the private victory celebrated in public company had the specific quality of satisfaction that comes from being understood correctly by a craftsman, the joy of the finally well-tended head, small and real and entirely worth toasting. The woman supervising the young slave girl's first solo work on a household guest was supervising from the chair with the specific quality of a teacher who has decided that observation is the remaining instruction, and that the moment for further instruction has passed, and that what the student needed now was the experience itself. The girl worked with the absorbed focus of someone performing for the first time without the safety net of the supervisor's intervention, and the work was good, the hands were steady, the judgment was showing itself, the accumulation of hours of training was visible in the precision of each small decision. The warm interior domestic setting held the transfer of skill with the quiet attention of rooms that have been the location of many such transfers, where knowledge has moved from the people who held it to the people who needed it with the patient continuity of households that outlast their individual inhabitants. The tonsor examining the new iron shear in the morning light was holding it up with the specific assessment of someone who has been blaming his tools and is now performing the act of acquiring better tools as a form of resolution of the blame. The blade caught the warm tonsorina morning light and held it in the specific way of fresh metal, the reflection sharper and brighter than the reflection of used metal, the edge as it had come from the maker rather than as it had been used and become. His assistant watching knew what the examination represented, knew that the new shear was the beginning of a new professional story that his employer was writing about himself, the story in which the tools had been the problem and the new tools were the solution, and the knowledge sat in the assistant's expression with the careful neutrality of someone who is not going to say anything about the story's premises. The man arriving home after the perfect haircut and his wife's expression of genuine pleasure when she saw the result was the image of a small morning going exactly right, of the particular domestic happiness that exists when one of the daily things that can go either way has gone the right way. She knew the difference. The warm domestic atrium scene of the moment contained two people who both knew the difference, who had been in the household together long enough to know what the arrival from the tonsor looked like when it had gone well and when it had not, and the expression of genuine pleasure was genuine because it was recognizing something real, the specific condition of a man who had had his hair cut well and knew it, and was arriving home in the full possession of this knowledge. It was a small happiness. It was the kind of happiness that Roman domestic life was full of and that required no commentary beyond its own occurrence. The two reflections in the polished bronze mirror, the man and his barber, viewed from behind, both facing the same surface together, showed two people studying the same problem from opposite sides of the professional relationship. The man's reflection showed what had been done to his head. The barber's reflection showed the face of the person who had done it. Both reflections existed in the same warm amber surface, in the same morning sidelight that pressed through the marble tonsorina's window at the angle specific to early mornings, and the mirror caught both the haircut and the accountability for it simultaneously. The outcome and its author, the result and the person responsible for the result, contained in the same impasto surface in the honesty that bronze mirrors always offered, without softening, without selection, showing everything that was there with the patient, comprehensive fidelity of reflective metal that had been polished and was doing its job, as the Tunsor had been, as Rome had been, as the day continued to require of everyone in it. If you got something out of this, leave a comment. I'd love to know what hit you hardest. And if you think someone else needs to hear this story, send it their way. Don't forget to subscribe and sound notifications for the next video. I'll have something new up soon. Until then, take care of yourself.